For those of you I haven't met, my name is Tony Janaitis. I'm the director here at the Pardee Center, and I'd like to welcome you to the first seminar of the semester, and thank you for choosing to spend an hour or so of your time with us. If you don't know about the center, we're an interdisciplinary research center here on the campus of Boston University. It's really dedicated to the proposition of first trying to understand the forces that cause the world to unfold the way it does over a matter of decades, whether they're economic, political, environmental, or all of the above. And secondly, to try to promote outreach and communication, but not only amongst different disciplines, scholarly disciplines, but communication to policymaking and decision-making communities. And thirdly, to create an atmosphere where we can begin to train a new generation of scholars for whom this is their passion. And so I'm really very excited about today's seminar, as I said, the first seminar of the semester, because our speaker is Laurence Delina, who's been here for about a year as a postdoctoral associate. And Laurence is going to talk about one of the major environmental, economic, policy, and diplomatic challenges of these days, which is the response to anthropogenic climate change. This is an issue that's been discussed for really quite a long while, of course, but in some ways it's only in recent years that we've appreciated the urgency with which responses are in fact necessary. And Laurence, in this book, Strategies for Rapid Climate Mitigation, Laurence examines the proposition of what other kinds of models are there for this kind of very rapid mobilization of social, political, and economic resources. So with that having been said, let me just introduce Laurence, and who will take it away.
Thanks so much, Tony. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Laurence is the name, Filipino. I'm originally from the islands, south of the archipelago. I came here, as Tony said, last year, July actually, right after I finished my PhD at UNSW, University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. But before that, I have a career at the United Nations and at the Land Bank of the Philippines, which is a development bank. I have produced the book here in the center, which proves to be a very conducive place to write, and I thank Tony for allowing me to do so. I thank my wonderful colleagues for being so supportive and in celebrating this milestone in my academic career. Special thanks as well to Cynthia Barakat, who read parts of the manuscript and suggested improvements. So this is the front cover of my book. The book has been published middle of June this year by Routledge ArtsCon, and it is available in the market. And I think I have Teresa has some flyers about the book. If you want to purchase it, there's a 20% discount. The images of the book is actually from the U.S. National Archives. It was taken in 1943 in August, about probably 2 years after the intense mobilization for wartime mobilization in this country had occurred. This shows workers checking a newly completed PV-1 aircraft at the Lockheed factory in Burbank in California. So this book is part A of my dissertation on non-technical strategies for rapid climate mitigation, and it is based on a 2013 peer-reviewed article which appeared in Energy Policy. I have also produced some snippets that appeared in the conversation during the Paris Agreement, which is very much related to the topic of the book, and at the same time I have presented some parts of it in various conferences from around the world. The topic of the book is actually new during that time, but it has been getting that much attention very lately, including this one from Bill McKibben, which appeared in the New Republic last month. Last year there was a piece at the Atlantic which also talks about the suggestion of using the wartime mobilization as a model for rapid climate action. But my project, in contrast to Bill McKibben and this piece at Atlantic, is that I think this is to my knowledge, the first book-length exploration of what actually the climate action and rapid mobilization for climate change could actually mean. It was motivated by the need to develop a contingency plan for future climate mitigation response. Future here can be really, really short term, in fact. It can be regarded as a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment. And like McKibben's take on the topic, the book includes or consists of less metaphorical use of the word wartime mobilization. Rather, it is a critical analysis of whether that sort of analogy, I would like to use the term analogy here, it can indeed be used as a model for climate mobilization. That distinction, I guess, is very important, and I'm bringing this approach from a critical point of view. And to that end, I have actually inserted a question mark at my subtitle to make this particular point explicit. And I would like to basically start my book seminar by telling you my headline conclusion. So my conclusion is that for effective climate mitigation, the strongest policy in the energy sector, which represents the largest share of the emissions pie, is necessary to drive rapid emissions reductions. And that the human story of the speed, the scale, the magnitude, and the volume of wartime mobilization provides this very useful analog in designing policy for accelerating a needed energy transition. However, the use of the wartime analogy itself has to be taken with caution. As with wartime, I am taking a stronger government-centric approach to climate action in this analysis. The premium over government regulation of the energy sector is provided for at least 4 reasons. First, current markets distort the price of energy services, which does not really reflect the negative environmental and social problems associated with the production and consumption. Second is that the investment cost of innovation in the energy sector, from research to development to demonstration and for scaling, in particular, is tilted. Since other actors can simply free ride on the innovations of other actors, this makes investment in energy innovation that benefits the larger society tends to be less. The third reason for the use of for placing much premium on government is that our current energy infrastructure, the pipelines, the transmission systems, and the grids we have are currently shaped around incumbent energy technologies. And in an innovated energy system, this kind of infrastructure may be less relevant. For instance, the preference over distributed and decentralized systems may require lesser investment in transmission systems and grids in this new scenario. Pipelines may also become stranded assets as the need for oil and gas is diminished over preference for wind and solar energy, for example. And fourth reason for the choice of government over the market is that valleys of death or aspects of innovations that are perceived to be too risky for investment are not attentive to or are not attractive to private investment or private investors. Since private companies seek profits first, their incentive to support large-scale new energy technology systems, for instance, is quite limited. Now, for these reasons, the accelerated transition strategies in the energy sector are required, one that could be best triggered by the strongest possible set of government policy and regulations. Now, this particular transition would require a portfolio of technologies, and in this particular assumption, I'm using renewable energy technologies coupled by large-scale harvesting of energy efficiency and conservation potentials that recognizes the need for scaling. Now, the question for scale has already been shown to be addressed by a lot of studies. There's actually a preponderance of models and studies at the global, regional, and national scales suggesting that the safe, ecologically sustainable, and large-scale transition to 85% to almost 100% renewable energy with energy efficiency is technically plausible. It's possible. And I have summarized these numerous studies for their common strategies in 3 key areas: electricity, transport, and heat and cooling. Now, for strategies in the electricity sectors, the studies have actually called for for the retirement of conventional fossil-based power plants and the replacement with renewable energy systems while harvesting the full potential of energy efficiency and conservation. Electricity sector strategies in these new studies also called for the deployment of new transmission lines that would link new renewable energy generation points or regions with consumers. It also includes accelerating research on efficient and low-cost energy storage, which is a huge gap in the transition literature. Now, for transport strategies, those studies actually include strategies that involve phasing out fossil fuel-based passenger transport and to replace them with improved public transport systems that are fueled by renewable energy, including the use of large-scale use of biking and walking. And for fostering the development of electric vehicles whose batteries are charged with renewable energy for urban use while using biofueled vehicles for rural road and air travel. Some studies have even suggested to put or place moratorium on the use of air travel and long-range traveling. In addition to that, some transport strategies in those studies I have shown in the previous slide are required to foster the development of electric vehicles for greater use of rail for long-distance transport in case, and the obvious need to fill the gap in terms of research regarding advanced and ecologically sustainable biofuels. Now, for the third chunk of that energy sector transition, I'm looking at those particular studies also suggested strategies for improving energy use, energy production and use for heating and cooling. And two of the strategies include making all inhabited buildings energy efficient through both active and passive interventions. And in addition to that, there's also the need to expand cogeneration and trigeneration, the use of geothermal heat pumps, solar space heating and cooling, and solar hot water in appropriate regions. Now, many of these studies have largely placed premium on the role of renewable energy and in expanding the role of energy efficiency. Now, in some studies, there is some role for fossil gas. However, this role tends to be very minor and can be seen mainly in cogeneration, trigeneration, in fueling peak load gas turbines for the grid, but not necessarily for fueling motor vehicles and base load power generation. The role for nuclear in these studies is also substantially reduced to zero, since commercially available nuclear power have very long construction and deployment times, the median of which is 9 years, with some taking even 30 plus years. In addition to that long planning and siting periods, the perception of risk is also recognized as a major hindrance for including nuclear energy in future energy mix. We think of Fukushima here, for instance. And not to be missed for the reasons why nuclear is not part of that future energy mix is the unsustainable nature of its fuel. Uranium, after all, is a depletable resource. Now, the chosen technologies for accelerated energy transition, therefore, will comprise multi-scale, already proven and demonstrated wind, water, sunlight, and geothermal technologies. This particular choice readily responds to the question of pace, considering that on average, these technologies takes between 2 to 4 years to deploy. And to maximize renewable energy potential, their deployment has to be supported by the use of smart grids and storage systems, which unfortunately remain to be major technology gaps. The technology component of the transition seems to be the easiest aspect to envisage, and there's a preponderance of studies about it. More challenging, I contend, is the pace of deployment, meaning how these renewable energy technologies and energy efficiency could be deployed in an accelerated fashion. The issue of pace is key in effective climate action. The fifth assessment report from the IPCC, for instance, suggests that to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius by end of the century, emissions have to peak by 2030 and should already be decreasing by 2050, reaching negative levels by the end of this century. The challenge of a 1.5 degrees Celsius, which has been floated during the Paris talks, therefore only entails a much shorter peak and decline timelines. Yet the issue of speed is one that is less tackled. The Paris Agreement is even silent about it, about this most important aspect. Only recently that the topic of sustainable energy transitions is introduced with the concept of accelerated transitions yet to enter our climate energy lexicon, especially in the international space. Now, in this book, I tried to envisage one way to address that issue of pace by looking at wartime mobilization scenarios and to examine whether indeed these moments in history can provide us some lenses to envisage an accelerated transition to a renewable energy future. Now, to do that, I have reviewed stories or narratives of wartime mobilization in major combatant countries during the Second World War, combing nice-smelling books at university libraries in Sydney to envisage corresponding strategies for rapid climate mitigation. Now, in today's seminar, I would like to focus on one of the stories of those mobilizations, that of the United States. And I would like to present American narrative of wartime mobilization by first highlighting what I think is one of the most important addresses to the Congress delivered in this country. Now, on January the 6th of 1942, Roosevelt, which was less than 1 month after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and on Manila, which was then an American colony, Roosevelt addressed the nation in his State of the Union address. In his 6th of January address, Roosevelt told Congress that he made instructions to actually increase the production rate of airplanes in this country so rapidly that in 1942, this country will produce about 60,000 planes and increase that production into 120,000 in 1943. He also made instructions to increase the production rate of tanks from 45,000 to 75,000, anti-aircraft guns from 20,000 to 35,000, merchant ships from 6 million deadweight tons to 10 million tons. And the US made great strides in accomplishing these visions. By 1944, which was about 2 years after Roosevelt delivered that address, defense expenditures in this country increased to $90.9 billion, which is more than 1 trillion when you convert that in its 2010 value from a mere 1.9 billion in 1940. So you see that 47 times increase in a matter of 4 years. The results are very impressive. This country saw the production of more than 300,000 airplanes, about 87,000 tanks, 100,000 ships, 2.4 million trucks and jeeps, and 41 billion pieces of bullets. These numbers are way bigger than what Roosevelt had envisaged in 1942. And of course, the final result of the wartime mobilization effort was, we know it, victory for the US and its allies. Now that victory confirmed Stalin's words before visiting British and American diplomats at a state dinner in the Kremlin about 5 years before, on the 2nd of October 1941, where Stalin said that that Second World War would be won by industrial production. Now, while numbers provide some context on the scale and the magnitude of wartime mobilization, it is key to look at the processes by which these mobilizations had actually occurred. It is in these complex processes that my research interest in this project was laid. So in this book, I have examined how those rapid mobilization was actually possible by exploring 3 essential themes of wartime mobilization: that of finance, that of labor, and that of governance. Now, to mobilize financial capital, this government actually introduced a number of innovative policies. For the first time ever, income taxation in this country was made universal, and other allied countries followed suit. In Australia, universal income taxation also was made universal. And as a result of that, this direct taxation policy actually resulted into the collection of about $45 billion in 1945 money from a mere $8.7 billion 5 years earlier. So that is an increase of more than 5 times. In addition to that, to direct taxation, indirect taxation policy were also implemented in this country. mostly on resource competing goods, which are goods that compete with the mobilization efforts. So this included increase or new taxes on motor cars, on radios, on entertainment, and certain luxuries such as alcohol, cigarettes, and cosmetics. Now, in addition to taxation, this country's government during the war also resorted to public borrowing, which was mostly done by selling war bonds. By 1946, the volume of collected war bonds was about 185 billion in support for the American war effort. In addition to public borrowing and taxation, new fiscal policies were also instituted to ensure that American dollars remained within the nation during those times. And this was done through stricter banking controls and interventions in lending. Now, while financial mobilization was vital for wartime mobilization, labor, which was perhaps the most important resource during those times, was also successfully mobilized during this time. By 1944, 7.7 million more Americans were employed in civilian work compared to the numbers in 1939. Almost everyone during this period who wanted to work found work. Nonetheless, there was still a scarcity in terms of the availability of workers to work in newly constructed munitions factories. And to address this gap, new labor policies were enacted. And some of these policies include conscription, increased working hours, policy changes regarding strike actions, and the employment of women as shown in this image. Now, to facilitate rapid changes for the mobilization of finance and of labor, public institutions were also redesigned. Wartime placed premium on the primacy of governments over the market. And for about 4 years, this country was centrally governed. The bureaucracy was bloated as government created new agencies while strengthening existing ones. And about 162 new agencies were created in the US at wartime, with most of them working in a now more stronger executive branch. Now, it is key to note here that although the executive branch had increased the number of agencies below it, under its tutelage, many of these agencies were quickly abolished at the end of the war. Many, but not all. So the question now is, if such history of quick mobilization was possible, what sort of analogous strategies can be applied in accelerating the deployment of renewable energy technologies that we hope could result to the rapid reductions in emissions? Or another way to frame this question is, what can be replicated in principle and what should be avoided? Now, recent imaginations of the wartime climate mobilization analogy have appeared alongside images that tended to superimpose the images during the historical mobilization during the war with that of accelerated transition on rapid climate mitigation. For example, this is the image used in Bill McKibben's piece in the New Republic. This one is the image that the group called the climate mobilization has been using. However, this is the image that I like very much. This particular image accompanied Dave Roberts of Greece, who used to work at Greece, he's now at Vox. He reviewed my 2013 energy policy paper and used this image in his review. So just what this analogy between rapid or accelerated transition and wartime mobilization entails. So in this particular book, I present the results of my thought experiment according to the 3 themes I have employed in my wartime mobilization analysis, that of mobilizing finance, mobilizing labor, and mobilizing governance or government. I have also arranged my chapters following these themes. I won't be able to discuss these strategies today in great detail, so I have done this as thorough as I can in the book. What I can present here are the gist of these many strategies. Now, to mobilize financial capital for accelerated transition, strategies could include properly pricing carbon, which means implementing large and steadily increasing carbon price. And I think Bill McKibben had written something about this very recently at Yale E360. Economist Nordhaus suggests carbon price at $40 per ton, preferably through a tax. But if done through a trading system, the floor price must be high enough, and the distribution of free permits have to be very, very limited. In addition to pricing carbon, following with war efforts, we need to sell more climate mitigation bonds and making them attractive not only to institutional investors but also to individual investors, just as what this country did during the war. In addition to that, private sector participation has to be encouraged by introducing a well-balanced and well-designed feed-in tariffs, for example, that are decreasing in time, by increasing output quotas or renewable performance standards, and by providing preferential loans and grants to these private firms. That's for finance. For mobilizing labor, some strategies could include conducting labor and availability and requirement analysis at the state and the national levels, retraining and retooling existing workers, especially those who are working at fossil-based industries, for the labor needs of the transition, providing rapid skilling opportunities for new labor cohorts, especially for young people, and incentivizing transition-related courses in universities and colleges. Governing the transition entails more innovative institutional arrangements, and this most likely would entail a stronger executive branch and can be done by forming, in the book I am suggesting a special department for transition to lead and coordinate all transition efforts across public agencies as well as that of the private sector. This has wartime precedent. And I've talked about the War Resources Board and the role of other agencies during the war in this book as well. This department, just like during the war, has to be placed a notch higher compared to other departments in the hierarchy of the executive branch. The question of who will provide check and balance is, of course, a question that I've also addressed in the book. And to provide check and balance of what can be envisaged as an overly powerful executive branch, I am suggesting here a special ombudsman on transition and the creation of such agency. Nonetheless, these two institutions, that special department and the ombudsman on transition, have to be provided with substantial powers to execute activities for accelerating the transition. In addition, their purposes and ambitions have also made to be independent of politics. And to achieve that particular purpose, their structure can actually be designed following the structure of contemporary modern democratic agencies. And in the book, I have mentioned about three of those contemporary agencies. But for example, we can take central banks, for instance. There are legislations creating central banks in many countries, providing that they have to be independent of politics and free of whims of politicians. So I think that example provides a good illustration. Now, there are limits, obviously, to this thought experiment. The first of this limit is with regards to the technology, the technical limits. For instance, the rapid rate of deploying new energy technologies to replace existing ones is a phenomenon that would essentially defy energy transitions as we historically understood them. Vaclav Smil is a professor in Manitoba, and whose work has been read by Bill Gates, for example, and he's considered in energy policy discipline as the doyen of energy policy. I sent him an email asking for his thoughts about this study, and he makes an argument that accelerated transitions is actually impossible. Considering that the inertia of the existing complex fossil fuel systems, considering the expensive capitalization of the replacement systems, considering the scale of the needed replacements, and considering the many inherent problems with alternative conversions and its materials. While Smil in his arguments may be correct, other studies have actually suggested that some energy transitions have actually occurred in lesser times, implying that a transition to a renewable energy future is possible. Now, in addition to the technological limitation, there are also certain limitations with regards to society. the social limitations. And most important of this limitation is the still wide gap regarding the public acceptance of climate science, especially in this country. There are also mixed sentiments towards a centralized approach by executive government, which is a big hindrance in case. In addition to the technological and social limitations, there's also huge implications and huge challenges in terms of the politics, which can hinder the use of wartime mobilization as a policy model for effective climate action. Indeed, it is very highly unlikely for governments to invoke their emergency powers without a clear reason for them to do so. And even in the case of that clear signal, if that clear signal is available, there is still no guarantee that governments would deploy renewable energy. More likely than not, they will look for quick fixes, such as those provided by risky geoengineering. In addition, despite international agreement on the need to act on climate change, there is still very little interest for stronger climate action. Consider the pace of the required action, the speed. The submitted nationally and determined contributions, for example, generally reflect this lack of interest to rapidly reduce emissions. The other political challenge is with regards to the mobilization of financial capital, which I have suggested can be done only through increased new taxation, in addition to add to the public borrowing, for example, which taxation is one that has always been it's been a very difficult path to thread for politicians. There just exists that political fear of losing corporate support or tax revenues. Now, at any rate, if indeed governments agree on taking a rapid mobilization of renewable energy technologies and they will embark in an accelerated transition stance, there is that fear of having them transformed into coercive governments. In such case, there is never a guarantee that they would actually return to a state of normal democracy. Thus, wartime mobilization provides a model for accelerated transitions and rapid climate mitigation policy. My short response is yes, it does. However, it does not lend perfection to it. It is one that is not free of many contradictions and frictions. Now, in closing, let me quote in toto from Dave Roberts' eloquent review of my 2013 paper. He wrote, and I would like to quote him here in toto. A political conservative will see this analogy and think, aha, I know it all along. Liberals are using climate change as a pretense to grow government and increase its power over our lives. As an assessment of the motivations and ideology of those fighting against climate change, the wartime climate analogy is absurd, of course. But as an assessment of what must be done to secure real climate safety, it is accurate. In any scenario where mitigation is big enough and fast enough, government really will need to be bigger and more intrusive. That is very much worth worrying about. Getting through this ordeal while retaining the open democratic character of US government, such as it is anyway, will be tough needle to thread. However, it's worth noting that eschewing mitigation and instead trying to adapt to a 4 degrees Celsius world will create widespread suffering, migration, and desperation. Those in turn will lead to civil unrest and resource conflicts. Guess what governments do in the face of massive disruptions and unrest? They get bigger and more authoritarian. There's no libertarian choice here. A huge global challenge like climate change is inevitably going to mean more government action and intrusion. The choice is, do you want managed big government with a bounded set of plans and some amount of oversight built in? Or do you want panicked big government responding to migrations, famines, and conflict? I'm not exactly excited about either choice, but the former definitely strikes me as the lesser of two evils. End of quote. Thanks again for coming.
Laurence.
Yes, sir.
One of the things I wonder about is exactly how we undergo the transition force in terms of the labor. Clearly, when there's a huge capital investment and there's money to hire people to change their jobs, to focus on this effort, that builds the economy, presuming that the source of revenue is doesn't incur later costs. But once we've achieved that, it's hard to believe you'd need that large a workforce to maintain the infrastructure and keep the thing rolling. So what happens to all those people? And also, what is our answer to the complaints raised in the course of this election that nobody has a plan for the coal miners? Why are you looking like that?
I'm still floating in the air, actually, Liz. Yeah, just returned from Nanjing, so yeah. Yeah, the focus on labor is actually very important. That's why I actually spent a chapter discussing about it, and all this dilemmas surrounding the transition and its implications on labor. Is really an important issue that has to be addressed in the transition. And
but how does it go after war, and can't we just do that? Because we had a period of enormous prosperity built
Post-war.
on the technological spin-offs from the war. Would we expect the same thing to happen in an energy transition?
Oh, definitely. The short answer to that is yes. We can just be optimistic about having this continued labor prosperity from the transition onwards.
So what I wonder is, I'm Richard Premack from biology. What I wonder is, of course, it was the attack on Pearl Harbor and, of course, the Philippines, which stimulated the United States to make this great effort during World War II. What kind of event would stimulate the countries of the world to make this kind of effort that you're proposing? I mean, one would think that it was something like Hurricane Katrina submerging New Orleans, that it would be Hurricane Sandy submerging New Jersey and New York, but that didn't have the effect. So what would actually it take to convince the American people and the American government that such an effort is necessary, and also the government, for example, like the government of China?
Triggers and driving forces are actually the biggest dilemma in the construction of this particular contingency scenario. I have discussed the role of black swan events as possible triggers for rapid mobilization. However, that based on a number of psychological studies that says, for example, that people tend to react with much conviction if they were affected, right? But we can't really bank on that. The second part actually of my thesis talks about the role of social movements in driving the transition, considering that large-scale social changes in histories were actually products of large-scale social mobilizations. So I'm really uncertain whether what sort of event can trigger the required change. Some people banks on the psychological use of black swan climate events, such as really big accidents that would basically lead to thousands of people dying. There are also some who banks on the role of the climate action movement. I'm just uncertain, but I have discussed those kinds of triggers, the cons and pros of using them as trigger devices, as mode for driving change here in the book.
Hi, Laurence.
Hi, John.
I'm just curious about your thoughts on the importance of shift in the context of the global political economy and the real move towards neoliberalism and changes in the nature of global capitalism, a shift towards financialization and movement away from more capitalism being invested in finance as opposed to physical infrastructure, and how these big changes in global political economy and shifts in capital might be important to whether this type of strategy could be enacted.
I can only share my thoughts, and yeah.
That's what I want.
Yep. Kevin Anderson, who used to be the director of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research, actually wrote this piece in Science or in Nature about the need for changing the global economic system and to transform the capitalist neoliberal orientation of states as a means to address climate change rapidly. I have discussed that as well in the book, that sort of things. And if we use that wartime mobilization narrative as a point of departure, we see that for 4 years this country has actually veered away from its market orientations and solely became a centrally governed system. It worked, and some observers, some academics such as Kevin Anderson banked on that change as a necessary precondition, whereas some also suggest that we can still continue being in a capitalist-oriented system while addressing the challenge of climate change in the required pace. My opinion for that is definitely, I think you have to go back to the underlying factor why we have climate change in the beginning, and it's that neoliberal system that perpetuate and was even the very reason why emissions kept on piling up the past decades. So at least by addressing that particular system and changing that into a new one could lead into rapid reductions. But unfortunately, I myself don't have that picture of what that particular new system will look like. Well, there are talks about there are people who use the word new economy in that setting, like the use of more bottom-up approaches, the role of cooperatives, the role of local governments in action in climate action, which are actually registering a lot of successes, and I'm just very uncertain whether what that particular system would look like. But Gaspeth has this particular project called envisioning a new system, I guess. And one of that system that is studying about is the use of more government-centric approaches in responding to environmental challenges.
So, Laurence, in this challenge of in this challenge of putting the U.S. and a U.S. economy on a wartime footing in World War II, you know, there was this external enemies, right? External enemies in both the Pacific theater and the European theater, and so in a sense, the conflict was immediately apparent, and but climate change, it strikes me, this is very different. This is not a clear external enemy. This is the result of our own choices, largely. And this is a result of things that we do every day, like turn on the light bulb, turn the key in the ignition. And it strikes me as being, this is a different kind of mobilization problem in terms of, it was, in one sense, relatively easy for Franklin Roosevelt to go to General Motors and Ford, you know, and the aircraft industry and say, you know, you will do this, and even that wasn't easy for him to do. Who does the president go to say, you will, you know, manufacture 1 billion solar panels in the next 10 years, or else, you know, where's the industrial base that's actually going to get torqued to do this? How might you envision that working in today's world?
It's a very interesting and at the same time very challenging question, Tony. Bill McKibben actually wrote about that distinction between wartime and climate mobilization, saying that yes, during wartime we have a clear enemy, whereas and for climate mobilization, the enemy is us. So that I think responds to your first question. Your second question, I think, is about who will do it. Right. So there are, I think, two schools here. Like the first school is that, yeah, leave it to the market, leave it to our institutions, leave it to the private firms to do things. Whereas on there's another school of thought that says that let us review the ways in which we produce and consume energy. Renewable energy resources tend to be more distributed, therefore they can be harvested by almost everyone on top of their roofs or by participating in cooperatives. By replicating or by multiplying this individual, very localized, very decentralized, very distributed activities, probably we can address global climate change. So I think those two schools are actually not competing schools, but I think both are needed. We need large-scale infrastructure, definitely, to power up our development. This is especially true for developing countries like mine. At the same time, we need to change the ways, the business models that we tend to put energy into a bracket or into a box before, and that entails using more distributed, more localized kind of energy models. Yeah. Yes, Nathan.
Great job, Laurence, on the book and the talk. And Nathan Phillips from Earth and Environment, just to build on Tony's point that taking an industry and kind of strong-arming them into doing something a little bit different, like making tanks instead of automobiles, is one thing. But the fossil fuel industry, whose complete business model is about burning the assets that they have, I think the other thing is really shifting industries to policies and incentives that favor and really mobilize the renewable clean energy economy. And what do you do about the entrenched, established fossil fuel industry that essentially cannot admit that they have to strand their assets because of the rules of the SEC every year that requires them to show that they're replacing the reserves that they sell every year? It's baked into their business model. And so I don't know how you deal with the entrenched fossil fuel industry, which, as we know, really controls so much of our political system. So it's a tough one.
It's a very tough question. I actually discussed the role of vested interests in the transition in the book as well, and how they tried all their best to not to do the effective climate action because it's contrary to their business agenda. In the second part of the thesis research, actually, I tried to discuss and to address this particular question, and that is through employing social mobilization lens. The role of grassroots-oriented, community organized movements in both driving away investments from fossil fuels. And the divestment movement, I guess, is the best example that we have in contemporary times. But I think there are still plenty of work to be done in terms of mobilizing grassroots, mobilizing people, mobilizing individuals, basically, to do what is right, to do what is morally right, as Bill McKibben and others have told us that before. Yes, sir.
Both of these last statements lead me to my question, and that is, it seems to me, first of all, that there is a resource in business. There's an entrenched renewable energy industry now that is one source of power toward this mobilization goal. But also, I'd be surprised if you hadn't already been in touch with the climate mobilization NGO that already exists. And there's a chapter in Boston, and I wonder if you could tell us if you have been in touch with them. And I think they're still pretty small. I haven't been in touch with them myself, but I work with the Chamber of Commerce and trying to shift businesses into saving energy, and that's where I'm headed. But that's starting to be mobilized across chambers of commerces across the country.
Great to know. As a matter of disclosure, I failed to mention that I actually sit on the board of advisors for the climate mobilization. So I've been working with them, providing advice for past few months already. So they are actually releasing a victory plan for climate mobilization very time soon. Paul Gilding, who happens to be the head of WWF in the past, has written a really nice foreword for that victory plan. It is still being reviewed. But hopefully that document will be released anytime soon, and they hope you will find time to read it.
Laurence, this is Les Kaufman. The seeds of change obviously need to be sown somewhere in some kind of a catalytic strategy. And I can imagine two scenarios. One is that we follow the advice of the last gentleman, and we engineer it in the U.S. through NGOs, through political movements, things of that nature. But the other possibility is for a country like the Philippines to just goddamn do it. And show up this recalcitrant Congress and put the fear of the market in the hearts of American business, so that they have to respond quickly or just relinquish that new market. Is this just a fantasy, or is it a possibility?
I think it's a possibility. I have actually written an opinion piece at the Philippine Daily Inquirer. It's a leading broadsheet in my country. in this month about the possibility of making a transition, a 100% transition to renewable energy in my country, based on a number of studies and based as well on the book. As not because we want to make a good contribution to the reductions in emissions. We only basically have a 0.025% contribution, but to make a good impression in the international states that despite the fact that we are a climate hotspot, we still want an energy system, a future that is powered by renewable energy. Costa Rica had done their shot in this area. They were, for the past 2 months, they were able to power their electricity systems 100% from renewable energy, although they're still relying on imported gasoline to power their transport systems. But still, it's a huge thing, and I have actually written this piece on the Inquirer about the Philippines making a gaze at Costa Rica, in addition to this current government's gaze at Colombia, for example, and its war on drugs. Yes, Tony?
So, Laurence, one of the things that happened as a result of this mobilization of the U.S. economy was that when the war was over, we had this manufacturing colossus, right? So instead of, this is really the birth of the aerospace industry in this country. So instead of making bombers, they made airliners. Instead of making tanks, they made Cadillacs, and the difference might be small. Cadillacs were generally not armed, but they were about that size, and there were jobs. And so, is there the potential, and that had good consequences and not so good consequences. This was the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned people about. What's the industrial colossus that's waiting to be born? If there really were a really rapid and large mobilization of economic effort for renewable energy, who are the potential winners? This created this enormous entrenched interest.
Well, the colossus.
His spacecraft better stop blowing up then.
True.
Yeah. But who are the winners? Are they still entrepreneurs? Are they still kind of out there? Is it the Elon Musks of the world and Richard Bransons and these entrepreneurs, or is it people that we don't recognize.
Or maybe the
yet.
cooperatives, or maybe, you know, individual households, which are basically citizens of this country and citizens of the world. I don't know, Tony. We were studying here about the long-range future, but I think it's just very uncertain. It really depends, I guess, on who will do the innovation first, and who will take that innovation first. Probably Nathan has some additions to that.
To me, I just think of energy shifting from being a commodity to a service and a technology. And that really means the death of an industry, a death of a colossus, because energy is no longer going to be this thing that you purchase like you purchase sugar or wheat or flour through a pipeline or a tanker or something. It's a service that's provided from technology, and it scales very differently. And I think it's just a totally different industry, but I think it can be a colossus. It needs to be.
Actually, could I add to that? It seems to me that the real winner potentially in this whole process might be China, because if you look at where the growth is in terms of industrial capacity in the world, it's to a large extent China, and to a lesser extent India, and that maybe at some point India or China will decide that it's going to start moving toward this reduction of greenhouse gases. They will take the lead in this. They will reorient their economy, and maybe they will be the ones that will really benefit from the transition.
Yeah, that's a big possibility. I just returned from Nanjing, actually, for an Energy Transitions in Asia symposium, and most of the papers there were not using the word climate change as its driver. It's pollution, and they experience it firsthand. I think if China make great strides in transitioning its dirty energy systems into cleaner ones, they will definitely win. And I think, given the fact that their governance arrangement is well attuned into into making that engines of large-scale mobilization, it perfectly fits within this particular kind of vision. Maybe they will.
China can scare our industry into trying to catch up if they get started.
I'm Dennis Karlberg, the Sustainability Director here. I think China is already moving way ahead of us, and I think they have really dropped the price of solar, which is benefiting us now. Back in the 70s and 80s, we had the technology. We were developing the technology for both wind and solar, and then we stopped. And Japan and Germany really leapfrogged beyond us, and now we're catching up. But so I'm hopeful that all these other countries that are moving, and we're working to catch up. I think Elon Musk is one example, but there are many. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of reason for hope for the U.S. But I wanted to ask a question, and you've talked about a lot of sort of a broad range of things, and we're all looking for solutions. So I'm wondering, in your mind, after all of your research in markets and everything else, what you see as, for the U.S., the most likely potential solution. I mean, politics are politics, and that makes things really complicated. But just in terms of mechanisms, what do you see as the better opportunities out there?
It's a very difficult question, especially for someone whose expertise is not on the U.S. energy policy. But I think it's a mix. I believe in the use of heterogeneous policy mixes, like combining small and medium and big approaches to transitions. I think this is very important. Making those connections very explicit, I guess, is also important. The role of cooperatives. We in the Philippines look at the U.S. experience in terms of the role of electric cooperatives in basically providing universal energy access. That's one thing that this country has for a long time, and I think we can revisit the role of cooperatives again in the transition. There's good literature going on in that area. What else? Redesigning the market basically is also important, but Those are in terms of policy. But I think the most important here is how to trigger that particular transition. Because if you're successful in triggering change, I think these policies, these effective policies, will just come out and will just do its job. So I think the very question is how to trigger change, and I don't have a response to that. I have studied the role of social movements, as I have said earlier, as a trigger device, if you will, as a trigger agent. I have also looked at the role of this really big accidents that can be attributed to climate change as trigger devices. But rather, I think, in focusing on what policy this country needs, I think it's more of what sort of triggers we should work on in order for effective policies to be enacted. And the investment group has done its share, and I think we just need to multiply those sort of initiatives, which are very grassroots, very localized, very community-oriented, and start from there, I guess.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Kathy Buckley, Sierra Club. I've just been thinking as you've been talking about international tribunals and whether we could get some support at that level. We have the Paris Climate Agreement, we have the UN, and we also have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which does not recognize the Paris Climate Agreement, and as a matter of fact makes it more difficult to take action on climate because you allow countries like in these trade pacts, a country like a company in Canada can sue the United States for stopping the KXL pipeline. So have you discussed or thought about the possibly some entity above even our trade agreements that would allow us to push in that direction, in a better direction?
I've actually missed discussing about the international aspect of the rapid mitigation project that I've been talking about, but I have mentioned it. They actually devoted one chapter about the role of that particular of the international role, the international relations and the international space relations of space. That international space and in the book, and I have argued for the role of the United Nations in the rapid mobilization, and actually suggested for a rapid climate mitigation agreement to be enacted, which is more stringent than what we have at the moment. It can in the book I made some parallels with regards to the relative success that the Montreal Protocol had achieved, and probably make that as a blueprint for designing an international agreement for rapid mitigation. For one, I think personally, I submit there should be some need for an international governing body to coordinate international efforts on rapid climate mitigation, to ensure that there's this check and balances, there's the carrots and sticks are justly distributed.
Thank you for the presentation. There are two things. One, I'm profoundly ambivalent about the adoption of war mobilization as an approach to climate change. And I'm thinking that there are probably other metaphors and other scaling up of major responses that might be just as effective. You could, in fact, unravel the climate change puzzle by looking at the mobilization of the mass adoption of automobiles in the United States, done over a period of 15 or 20 years, going from 0 cars to everybody expecting, or huge numbers of people expecting to be able to drive an automobile. Or you could take a look at cell phones, from 0 cell phones to not being able to walk down the street without colliding with people who have their noses buried in cell phones every moment of the day, every day of the week. there are other models for looking at rapid technological change, and I understand partly you want government involvement, and you laid that out at the beginning, and so maybe war is the best we can do. But I think that there are all kinds of limitations of this as a metaphor and as a model. The other thing I was thinking about this rapid mobilization is, what if the United States suddenly found itself losing hundreds of thousands of jobs every single month, a financial system completely locked up and unable to have the credit markets working at all, a need for massive government intervention? You'd have 2008, 2009. And guess what? There was actually legislation, and I think it would be very informative for you to look at, where what happened to the legislative proposals that said we're going to take that unemployment, the need for massive public intervention suddenly, and devote it entirely or nearly entirely to proposals to take care of climate change. You need a $15, $20, $30 an hour job. Come to the Southwest United States, and we're going to build square mile after square mile after square mile of solar collectors and make the United States energy independent. Those kinds of ideas were floating around not very long ago, and guess what? Nothing happened. And so I think it'd be very informative to actually look at what happened in the context of quite recent history, where there were demands for that kind of mobilization. And even in that kind of disastrous economic moment, we ended up doing next to nothing.
I take that as a comment, but very quickly, I'm actually seeing myself working more on accelerated transitions. And one of that strand is to look at the historical moments of this really, really rapid changes in human societies. And one of this is just wartime mobilization. I really, really thank you, sir, for suggesting all those other moments in history that I can possibly look into. And I should stop with that one and then proceed with another question.
Hi, I'm Sean Donaghy with the Climate Mobilization, so I'm a huge fan. I was wondering if you delved into how the differences in the necessary manufacturing between, World War II, where they're just building a bunch of B-52 bombers that are all the same parts, all the same size, and shipping them across the ocean brand new, versus retrofitting a building like this to be more energy efficient, or redoing the energy grid while it's still up and operational. Do you think that the more nuanced challenges of this mobilization will decrease the pace that we are able to accomplish them?
I have no idea actually how to respond to the question, but I'll seek less help in this case.
Well, it's the follow-on. I might expect exactly the opposite, because our economy has really changed in character to one in which it's largely powered by innovation. Everybody wants the next new thing. And if we create a nimble industrial sector for producing renewable infrastructure, the fact that that infrastructure is going to evolve very rapidly may actually be good for the economy.
Right.
It's just a different mindset. It's like, imagine instead of a new iPhone, there's a new solar panel. You just got to get it.
Yeah. Here?
As others, I want to thank you for your presentation. And just as people are talking, I wonder if anyone has looked at, in my mind, mobilization will happen naturally within our current economic and political systems. At the small level, individuals will want solar panels because it reduces the amount of money they owe. And at a larger scale, national security will increase if we reduce our energy dependence. So has anyone looked at the time scale that the natural economic system will drive us toward our ultimate goal versus what we need to keep within the 2% or 2 degrees?
Probably Tony has some
So
thoughts.
I can say something about that. And I think mostly the answer is there's not a chance.
Not a chance.
Right? Because if you just look over the last couple of decades, the only period during which U.S., at least, CO2 emissions actually stalled and even went down a little bit, but not total greenhouse gas emissions, was as a result of the recession. And we've mostly made all that back up. This notion that it's really kind of peculiar, because if there was ever a time for people to borrow really large amounts of money to sink into new infrastructure and innovation, it's now. Interest rates are still effectively zero. And so there's no competition for all that capital. And so, you would think that the sort of economic landscape is actually really good right now for borrowing and investing in these technologies, but it's not happening at the scale at which to me, the big challenge is the scale, right? So the energy use globally and in the US skyrocketed after World War II, just completely skyrocketed. Almost all of it literally fueled by fossil fuels. And so now we have this enormous energy demand globally and growing. And so you're trying to keep up with two things at once, two big trends. And one is to keep up with the growing demand, which will continue to grow, particularly as developing countries seek to increase quality of life. And secondly, to do that at the same time as you just face this hard physical reality that if greenhouse gas emissions don't turn around and start coming down sometime between 2030 and 2050, and the earlier the better, we're going to blow right past 2 degrees C. And we're going to blow past it by a lot. And I wake up some mornings and I'd say, and I wouldn't bet on that. And I wake up other mornings and I say, if you move quickly, you could do it, right? Because the raw material is there to do it. But it really will require sort of a political transition as well as this sort of industrial transition, which is much more rapid than the energy system has ever seen before.
True. Yeah.
I have these ups and downs too, and I was on a conference call with Senator Pacheco and Representative Golding, I think his name is, who passed the latest energy bill. And Pacheco was saying that the Senate really wanted, he wanted, 3,000 megabytes, or I don't know, it was some much larger number than they passed in the bill. And I think he's pretty influential. So it made me feel like, and he made very clear that he's planning on pushing to add to the existing climate change bill that they just passed and try to get it more and more of the offshore wind. So there are, there are movements in the right direction. Whether I think you're right, the scale is the big problem, and I think it's a question of how fast all of us can move to move it forward. There's one guy who's trying to mobilize college students to have competitions on environmental issues. That may be a good way of going.
Yep. Some more time for a few questions.
Yeah.
There are.
Any more questions? Can we have John again?
If you wait, there'll always be a question.
Right.
I have a really quick one for this one. I wanted to follow up on the idea of different metaphors, Laurence.
Yeah.
And so, for perhaps closer an example to the wartime mobilization, did you think about Marshall Plan instead as a metaphor and reconstruction? Or is that perhaps more useful as we think about adaptation instead of mitigation?
I tried to look at the metaphor, the role of Marshall Plan in the reconstruction of Europe actually as one possible narrative to use in strategizing for rapid climate mobilization. I haven't really done further work about that, but I think it's in the back burner. Thanks, but I'll take that as a suggestion, and thank you so much. I'll add that to my list with this gentleman here. And I think we can, there's no more questions, Tony.
Well, if there are no more questions, let me thank everybody for taking the time and joining us, and thank Laurence for stimulating thought.